Open University.
Greetings, class. I want to be a musician today, which is what I am. It's a windy day outside. I'm dressed up warm because the wind brings the cold into my flat here in Osaka. So I'm going to look back over the decades and talk about percussion. Percussion as just one little... Wow, there's real breakers out there today. It's one little aspect of music production, which I've been involved in sort of continuously for 35 years or something. And I think it's very interesting because it's sort of problematical for me. I always hate formats. I hate the way that when you tour now as a rock band, you arrive at a venue and you already know what kind of fold-back monitors there are going to be, what kind of lights are going to be overhead, what kind of amplifiers are there, or there are small variations, but there's basically a format now. There's also been throughout my productive career as a pop musician or rock musician, whatever you want to call it, there's been this format of the rock band, the white indie rock band especially, being a 4-piece unit, occasionally a 5-piece unit, a 4-piece unit with a bass player, drum player, guitar player, vocalist, maybe 2 guitar players, and maybe a keyboard player. So since I hate standardization, I hate that format, and I've always tried to diverge from it. So my very first demos, scrappy, scratchy bedroom demos, which I made at the end of the 70s, the percussion on those was literally just me hammering on cardboard boxes. But mainly, my main percussion instrument at the time was Anglepoise lamp, which I had in my room. And an Anglepoise lamp has a lot of interesting potential as a percussion instrument. It has a metal shade which you can bang on with a pencil. You get a nice kind of cymbal-like sound. It has a spring, which is very important because, of course, reverberation, is usually done with coils, with springs. Mechanical reverb systems use springs. Of course, everything now is digital, and this is something we'll have to talk about, the fact that you go through these different phases where you're using real percussion occasionally and electronic ghost percussion, which nevertheless retains its links to real sources. And often as a musician, if you come in straight into the digital and ghostly end of things, you don't even know until you finally you encounter, say, a guiro. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but a guiro, I would know the sound because it would be like a preset on a synth or something. It kind of goes... But when you find a studio equipped with one, you find it's like a slap, what's it called, a slap, it's a weird, a cowbell, for instance, with a sort of mechanical slapper on it, or all these weird exotic percussion instruments. So initially starting out with also using prepared piano, because I had the family piano in the late 70s up in my bedroom in Edinburgh, and I would do the John Cage percussion treatment of sticking stuff through the strings. And of course you have both the clunky, plunky sounds of dampened strings there, but also the reverberation, because you can use the reverberation pedal on a piano. I don't even know how pianos reverberate sound, but they have this amazing echoey, spacey sound. I also used my acoustic guitar with a condenser mic stuck under the strings and a lot of tissue paper to dampen the sounds, and used that as a kind of pseudo-African percussion, almost kalimba-like, because I was very influenced by anthropological recordings you would get of African music. Which was trendy at the time because Talking Heads had promoted it. But came the time I had a band of my own. This was terribly exciting at the time, to step into the shoes of Paul Haig, and who'd left Joseph Kay. I think one of the reasons Paul Haig left Joseph Kay was probably that the drummer, Ronnie Torrance, was kind of a bad drummer, in that he couldn't keep time. If you listen to, say, Sorry for Laughing on the released Joseph Kay album, it's really speeding up and slugging down. I mean, if you set a metronome against it, it's pretty bad timekeeping. Ronnie took his inspiration from Paul Thompson of Roxy Music. I wasn't a huge Roxy fan. I didn't really know Paul Thompson's drumming. So I can't really compare him and say, well, you know, Ronnie does this and Paul does that. But Ronnie, I think to his credit, he had an interest in gadgets and accessories and kind of secondary, supplementary percussion. So, for instance, if you listen to the demo of Radio Drill Time, recorded in 1979, there's some really interesting. Ronnie has somehow acquired, borrowed or bought a Syndrum, and he's hitting it, and there are all these tracks laid on top of the song of percussion. I mean, the percussion is really awkward, but in a kind of interesting new wave, experimental way on that track. And it's pretty much the only time they do it, because by the time they get to recording their first album, The Only Fun in Town, they discard all electronics, because basically the Syndrum it's a synthesizer drum, it's a tuned drum, therefore it has affinities with African talking drums and things like that. But they've banished electronics, unfortunately. I think that an electronic Joseph K would have been more interesting. But I can see why Paul Haig would want to. He went out, as soon as he went solo, Paul Haig bought a Lindrum, which was a very expensive at the time drum machine, which I think has a really plodding wooden sound, really clunky and horrible. So, I mean, the early Paul Haig solo material is really marred for me by this awful drum sound, the Lindrum. I didn't buy a drum machine, I inherited Ronnie Torrance. My band, The Happy Family, first of all we had Ian Stoddart. Actually, I think the very first drummer might have been Malcolm Ross, who really set the band up for me. Malcolm, the guitarist, and Joseph K, who then went off to join Aztec Camera and Orange Juice. I think he helped out and played sort of floor toms at our first gig, which was in 1981, supporting The Cure. We were like third on the bill to The Cure, and also The Trees, second on the bill. And I think we actually didn't have a drummer at that point, and we just played, which is a very interesting lineup really, to have just bass and guitar, two guitars, and no drums. But I think maybe Malcolm was banging on a tom in the Velvet Underground style, you know, where you stand up and you just hit these very simple beats on a tom, which is very effective, obviously, in the Velvet Underground. We then got Ian Stoddart, who later played with Wynn and was really influenced by chic and sort of funky black drumming, and was technically a very good drummer. He unfortunately contracted Hodgkin's lymphoma while he was with the band and had to leave and get the ray treatment and everything. And luckily was totally cured and is still drumming, I think, still with us. And so we then got Ronnie Torrance, who joined us old muckers from Joseph K. And so the rehearsals, if you listen to rehearsal tapes of Joseph K or of The Happy Family, you hear people, Ronnie was hyperactive, full of a kind of sexual energy, very popular with the girls, very stylish guy, very well dressed, usually wearing braces with his hair slicked back. He was the most sort of new romantic of Joseph K, and also the most materialist. If you read their interviews, he was the one who wanted to drive a Ferrari and stuff, be a pop star. The rehearsal tapes, you'd just hear people saying, "Shut up, Ronnie," because he would just be bashing away at his kit the whole time, just loving the noise of it. And he played very hard and very loud, and he didn't keep good time, but he loved his accessories. And so by the time he was in my band, the accessory that was trendy, thanks to people like Spandau Ballet, was rototoms, which is a little, you know, these little toms on a sort of supplementary stand. So you'd sort of hit those and get this kind of slightly South American feeling. So chant number 1 by Spandau Ballet, I'm sure there's lots of little fills on rototoms. And but that couldn't really go on. I mean, my band disintegrated, and then I worked on demos with the keyboard player Neil Martin, and we were really into Japan and into David Sylvian's solo career especially. So our demos, like the pre-Momus demos at that point, were using drum machines, probably Roland drum machines at that stage, beatboxes, quite simple little cheap drum machines. But by the time I came to record Circus Maximus, the first Momus album, well, I mean, the first EP, The Beast with Three Backs, is interesting because I'm playing some prepared piano again. So I go back to my experiments in the bedroom at that point, percussion-wise anyway. I'm playing sort of based on an acoustic guitar and playing, basically using a prepared piano for percussion. There is no drummer on that record. There's also no drummer on Circus Maximus. Circus Maximus is mostly an acoustic guitar record, but it's also using some DX7 and emulated 2 percussion. So getting really into sampled percussion. The sampling revolution was super important for me as a solo artist, because you could, you didn't need drummers anymore, and I really liked simple beats, very self-deprecating beats mostly. I had a producer on my second album, The Poisoned Boyfriend, a guy called Julian Standen, who got in a beats programmer in the form of Dean Clavat, who later worked with Betty Boo and people like that, and was basically a session beats programmer. So from that point on, the next 3 albums or so, I'm programming before going into the studio with Dean Clavat. Or 2, I think just those 2, Poisoned Boyfriend and Tender Pervert, Dean Clavat worked on. And then using real percussionists, we had actually a guy called Arun Chandarnikar, I think his name was, an Indian percussionist playing tablas and things as secondary real percussion. So we're entering the stage of, which we're still in really, electronics mixed with acoustic sounds and sort of enhancing each other. The electronics can keep perfect time, unlike Ronnie Torrance, but they have a mechanical, rigid feeling like Paul Haig's drum machine, so you offset that with some human touch, real percussion over the top. I had a mania to do everything on my records, and so I stopped working with producers and I stopped working with Dean Clavat, the percussion programmer. I felt that I could do everything pretty well, especially guitar. That was my main instrument, but I wasn't very confident about percussion. But increasingly computers were able to correct my faults. Quantize was the thing. The quantization is when a computer corrects. Or swings, you know, you can put various swings on beats, make them metronomic or make them jazzy, whatever you want really. So the big change for me in music production was in 1990 when I got an Atari ST-1030 computer and was able to work at home sequencing my tracks before recording them. There was a little time when I was sequencing and taking that with samples and things into the studio and then remaking the tracks. But then I went wholly home recording in 1993, and because there was no point, once you had ADAT machines and DAT mastering and stuff, there was no point using studios at all. So I stopped using studios in 93, which happened to be the year I left Creation. I left Creation really at a stage where it was possible to work with 0 budgets, make records for no money at all at home. And I guess in the 90s, my percussion habits were to go out and get pre-made loops or even these CD-ROMs, which were sold by drummers, of endless little loops that they would make that you could sample, for you to sample. So they'd cost a bit more. Might cost £100 or something for one of these CDs. But you could, and I bought one. I think I only bought one officially, which was Chakademus and Pliers. No, was it Well, it was the beats behind Chakademus and Pliers, which was Sly and Robbie, Sly Dunbar, Robbie Shakespeare, the famous drum and bass partnership, who played on some Serge Gainsbourg albums and just endless reggae albums in Jamaica. So if you listen to the Philosophy of Momus, 1995. A lot of the beats on that are Sly and Robbie. The thing was to sample those beats and get this kind of very interesting, exotic Caribbean electronic percussion feel that was and wasn't reggae. I mean, it came out of that reggae experimentation and the sort of exoticism of the reggae sound and also the laid-backness of the reggae sound. But that was the 90s, that was the way we did things then. I worked with my Akai samplers, my Logic sequencer on my Atari. I then switched to Mac for sequencing, and and took several steps back actually, because I didn't want to pay for the Macintosh software, and tended to use, I really liked a child sequencer, educational sequencer with a little sort of bouncing ball on it, which was called Easy Vision. It was like the children's version of the Vision sequencer. But it probably didn't have very good quantize, if any quantize at all. So there are some Momus records that sound pretty ropey percussion-wise, and I think I kind of like sounding ropey, and I like experimenting. Wow, the wind is really howling. Sorry for the noise. So I guess I get more. I start listening to the turn of the century. I'm using a lot of Casio beats and Game Boy beats, sampling a Nintendo Game Boy. The little cute sounds of electronic games suddenly become very central to my sound, and it's kind of the cuteness and the lack of assertiveness. It's kind of the opposite of a human drummer, especially a rock drummer, who tends to slam an emphasis around everything. I mean, what you have to consider is that there is a grammar of drumming, and it can be the very cliched grammar of saying, okay, the bass drum is a bit like a heartbeat, you know, boom, 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 and then the snare drum is a bit like emphases on, you know, when you're doing strophe and antistrophe, when you're doing prosody, the rhythms of poetry themselves are already something you can simply amplify into a drum pattern. Ba-dum, 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 the boys stood on the burning deck. You can already extrapolate a drum part from that. And then you have things like the cymbals, the hi-hat, which is a kind of, that could be like human breathing, you know, they all have a metaphorical atmosphere. And then the sort of fast patterns on the hi-hats can represent nervousness, and then the cymbals are always a kind of excitement, a splash of emphasis, which you generally put in a certain place when you're coming into the chorus or whatever like that. I periodically go through stages of getting very bored with that traditional rock drumming grammar and being much more interested in, you know, I'll hear a Moondog record and say, wow, this guy, he uses percussion totally differently. Or I listened a lot to ethnic music, to Balinese music. Just the way that a gamelan orchestra will, which is a percussion orchestra, entirely percussion orchestra, will speed up and slow down and do these amazing things which are completely, how do they remember, how do they know, how do they follow the score, what is the score in that case. So I was much more interested in kind of, and I utilized a lot of accidents. So you'd have a Nintendo Game Boy percussion loop, and then you put it against, you know, slide down bar or something, and then something wouldn't quite work right, or there'd be some kind of delay thing, or all sorts of electronic effects you could do to layer that percussion, and then to take bits out. I think it's very important not to have too busy percussion and to leave space, because excitement is not about just adding more and more layers. It's about how, you know, the ma, as they say in the Japanese aesthetics, ma is the art of paying attention to empty space around things and how that space enhances the objects or sounds that you have. I think as an introvert, I don't like a lot of noise. I never could deal with people just bashing away at things, and I like subtlety and I like strangeness and also sensuality. If percussion, obviously the most sensual percussion is bossa nova percussion, that 1960s Western infatuation with South American music, tropicalia and bossa, which is a jazz sound. And now actually the music I'm listening to right now, which I'm most excited by, is ancient Greek music. And there's some amazing percussion, like ceramic percussion in that, which, you know, this reverberate. I used to actually play with the experiment. I'd take a cup or a glass, and if you knock two glasses together, you'd sometimes get this amazing reverberation which you could record. I actually would use that in my really early tapes. But now it's these Japanese folk records which I mess around with so much, and which have this traditional Japanese percussion in them. A lot of claves. I really love claves, and I could make one of these talks entirely about claves. In fact, that was my first idea for this one, because, for instance, Ashes to Ashes, which is probably my favourite David Bowie track, the claves in that are really beautiful. I don't know why they're in there. Was it Tony Visconti? Was it the drummer who put them in? Did Bowie himself say, I want claves in here? They're always in subtle places around the main beat, and they just give it this kind of wooden, tactile feeling that if you listen to it, records influenced by Ashes to Ashes. Actually, am I right in saying influenced by? Yeah, I think probably Magazine's Song from Under the Floorboards comes just after Ashes to Ashes, about the same time, and also uses claves. If you listen to the mix of that, there's some really nice little clave work going on there. Claves are just two pieces of wood that you clop together, but really give a personality. It's a nice way to not have a snare beat in there. Sometimes you can just have my song Gregor Samsa from the last album, the one before last, just has claves, doesn't have any snare or anything like that in it. A snare is too forceful in many cases, and the clave is just a really nice way to... Actually, the snare sound I use on a lot of my more recent recordings is a Harry Partch instrument, but it's one of these, it's a sample of a Harry Partch instrument, which is just a piece of wood at the side of a keyboard being hit. Partch liked the idea of using a lot of the physical properties of the instruments he built as percussion. I mean, guitarists have done this. All acoustic guitarists often sort of hit the wood of the guitar to make a kind of percussion. This is part of the flamenco repertoire. So I really like just quite dry wooden sounds. There was this syndrome, this problem in the 80s of hyperinflation, semantic hyperinflation around drums, the famous 80s big drum snare sound, when certain producers, and it kind of goes back to Bowie and Visconti gating the snares on low to make them sound bigger. You know, this boom, it's a big bang, and then it sounds like it's done with flanging, sounds like it's going to resonate, but then it just cuts off with a gate which you set the threshold of the gate, and then anything below that threshold is total silence. So it's this big noise succeeded by silence, and that makes it sound even bigger. That is the spirit of Ma. Again, the silence really makes it sound massive. And this was taken and then abused in the 80s with just people using that big drum sound, and ever bigger and bigger. And people like, if you listen to Infected by VV, you just hear it at its worst in a sense. He was obviously taking it from Bowie, I think. And it's just this enormous sound which is inhuman. I think reviews at the time described it as like looking at an office block that's sort of gleaming in the sun, and yet it's totally inhuman and heartless. Prince was the one in the 80s who called a halt to that, because Prince was funky, he knew what was funky, and that big sound is not funky. What's funky is using space right. So basically what was so revolutionary about Kiss and then Sign of the Times was that he was not using reverb on a huge snare sound. He had a very simple beat. I mean, actually very interesting, especially Sign of the Times, that and it's the space after that. It's this little, quite a busy little pattern, and then it just stops and then repeats. And there's really no other percussion. There is a snare which comes in later to hit that a little harder home, but it's just a masterful use. A masterful lesson that Prince gave there in how to use a very simple percussion pattern effectively without this hyperinflation, without this hugeness that everything at the time was doing. It's like economic inflation. There is nowhere to go after a certain stage of hugeness, and I think it obviously resonates with the politics of the 80s, which was, we are the world, we are so huge, as Iggy Pop put it. There was this hubris, which you can hear in the pop production. I was a fan in the 80s of, say, Holger Hiller. Holger Hiller's Hyperprism album, as it was called in Japan. It was called something else in Europe, Oben in Eck, where he's using along with Mimi Kobayashi, who he was working with at the time, had a very Japanese way of programming the emulator percussion sounds in a sort of pseudo-Brechtian way. And it's something I also draw from percussion-wise, that there's certain grammar that the little theatre pit bands that Brecht and Weill would have used for the Thruppenny opera used percussion. For instance, there's a very distinctive open hi-hat sound that the Weill would use, which, I mean, it's quite a common 1920s gesture, where you it sort of adds an emphasis to the lyrics at that line, you know. The way to get laid is, there's a little, the charm song, which is kind of reproducing that a little bit. It goes, there's a line, the way to get laid is to hang around drunks, you know. It can put a little witty emphasis in the middle of a line, for instance. But also there was a kind of Asian sound. Some of those viol arrangements sound to me, or Dessau, or you know, all the Brecht's collaborators, they seem to be influenced not just by American jazz, ragtime, bebop, all that stuff, but also by Asian music and Chinese music. And I really love the percussion in Chinese popular and folk music, you know, where you have these beautiful tuned drums, which are doing sort of bong, you know, sort of doing little beautiful figures. Tuned percussion is wonderful. It's wonderful if you have it in tune with the rest of the song, and also if you have it out of tune. So that's my dissertation on percussion. I'm sure there's a lot more to say. What more could I say? The main message I would say about percussion and Momus is that I don't have a style, and I don't know what's good. And I think that not knowing is kind of actually much more important than knowing. I could never do a drums masterclass because I don't know what's good, and I just go with my taste for a certain kind of vulnerability, brokenness, sensuality, or cuteness, or whatever it is. But it is part of a worldview, and I think that's important. It's very important for me to do it myself rather than simply this division of labour thing where you simply get a drummer in and say, you know, do your thing, do your drumming thing, give me the drumming which is standard. That's what I hate. I hate that kind of idea of there being a standard and acceptable form of something which everybody has. I hate it equally in screenwriting, or, you know, there has to be a centre of goodness in your script, and you have to put the cat in the tree and get the cat out of the tree again. You know, all that stuff, all those rules are absolutely poisonous, need to be thrown away, ripped up and thrown away before you will produce work of any creative merit.
Open University.